Good morning, educators. It is a privilege to be able to speak to you all today, and we'd like to thank the Taos Institute for this opportunity. We would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. My name is Annabel Bailey.
I'm Katja Petro.
I'm Isaac Wade.
I'm Charlotte Thomas.
And my name is Amy Oosthuizen, and we are all fourth-year medical students from the University of Newcastle and University of New England.
Today, we will be discussing our novel approach to qualitative literature analysis, what we refer to as speed dating. We developed this as a way to apply a hermeneutic methodology, which is essentially an individual and personal theory, into a collaborative group project.
We've been working together for the past 2 years under the supervision of Dr. Karin and Dr. Crocker for the research component of our degree. For the first year of this project, we were split across 2 university campuses, and so we worked together over Zoom. We then all relocated to Tamworth at the start of this year, allowing us to transition to a more in-person collaboration, for the first half of the year at least.
For our project, we conducted a literature review using philosophical inquiry to answer the question, what is the nature of patient-centered end-of-life conversations in the emergency department?
The end of life is an incredibly personal and significant time for all parties involved. Healthcare delivered at this time should be personalised and inherently patient-centred, and in line with patient wishes and values. In order to do this, it is essential that healthcare professionals firstly have an adequate understanding of these wishes and values. This is where patient-centered conversations come in. Patients frequently present to the ED for end-of-life care, providing a unique and important opportunity for these conversations to take place. However, there are numerous barriers which often make holding these conversations challenging, including time pressures, competing demands on staff, and the inherent life-saving focus of the ED, often deeming these conversations of low priority.
So, we found that there is currently a gap in the literature exploring the comprehensive nature of these conversations. Through interpretation of the literature, we hope to explore the complexities, provide insight into, and initiate reflection on end-of-life conversations and subsequently experiences in the ED.
Our approach to the research project was to adopt a methodology of philosophical hermeneutics. This concept was entirely new to our empirico-analytical medical mindset, and it required a lot of exploration before we applied it. So what is philosophical hermeneutics?
Good question. To try and say this in simple terms is a bit of a challenge, but I'll give it a go. Philosophical hermeneutics is the theory and method of interpretation. It provides the principles to which the research methodology can be built, rather than providing a structured methodology itself. So these principles in the modern context revolve around creating a constant dialogue with the text. This begins with identifying an initial horizon of understanding, acknowledging the interpretations of the literature exist within the cultural and social context of the reader.
And then this sort of begins a cycle in which the constant dialogue creates a relationship between the reader and the text. And from this, a deeper understanding continues to develop. This is a very iterative process. The reader needs to engage with the text and conceptually develop and express their understanding. And as such, it can be a difficult process for a few reasons. Firstly, it requires a lot of concentration and deep thinking, which can be exhausting. And secondly, it is a very personal and individual process between the person and the text. So applying it to a group research project can be difficult. The ultimate goal is to develop a deep communal understanding. However, to develop an understanding that is both deep and communal requires strong relationships between the researchers and the ability to avoid just agreeing at the point beyond which our understandings diverge.
Hence, we needed to develop a research strategy that allowed us to do an interpretive review in the philosophical hermeneutic paradigm in a group setting. In more literal terms, we asked ourselves, how can we make this methodology collaborative? How do we avoid just agreeing rather than exploring differences in order to develop a deep understanding? How do we share our understandings without having one dominant voice? How do we embrace bias and conflict in this process?
Our solution was to view our research through a lens of relational humanism, learning through our relationships with each other, our supervisors, and the texts. Research, particularly qualitative, literature-focused research, is commonly done through an environment which felt at odds to the independence of a hermeneutics approach.
What we realized, though, was that our process of learning and understanding had always been, at its core, about relating with each other. Researchers work collaboratively together towards the common goal, engaging in an ongoing dialogue of intertwined listening, hearing, and speaking.
Exactly. And when you do some reading into and reflecting on the concept of relational humanism, especially looking at how in a group setting you can move beyond just agreeing for the sake of agreeing and into the field of collaborative sense-making, one key term comes up. When researchers share their understanding and interpretation of text with each other, aiming not just for superficial agreement, but deeper understanding, they adopt a relational approach to interpretation. Themes and concepts develop from collective, relational ideas and discussion. Our actions, values, and assumptions, which form the basis of our individual hermeneutic horizon of understanding, are actually constantly shifting through our interactions with others.
It is probably important to note that at this point in our research journey, we had developed strong pre-existing relationships and friendships over the course of a year creating a research proposal, and a couple of months refining our research methodology. With these strong relationships in mind, achieving a deep connection while working together was a relatively natural process. Aiding us in this process, whether with the intention of strengthening connections or not, our supervisors created many activities and tasks which allowed us to explore our relationships within the research context further.
It is also worth noting, though, that it doesn't necessarily take a year to develop relationships that form a good basis for this approach. I joined the research term at the beginning of this year, only a couple of months prior to this process taking place. My integration was supported by our supervisors helping me get up to speed and metaphorically catching up to the peloton through introduction to the subject and the hermeneutic process.
Through developing deep connections, engaging with uncertainty, and valuing difference, we strive towards developing a relational presence, necessary to constructing a collective understanding. Working as a collective, grappling with new concepts and uncertainties allowed us to remain relationally present as a whole, even if as individuals doing so is impossible, thus leading to a collective understanding far deeper than each individual researcher's understanding.
Yeah, and creating this shared relational presence manifested itself in many ways. Robust group discussions, individual monologues shared with the group, and then analysing each other's writings and pictures. But at the end of the day, this is all very theoretical. It's one thing to describe a theory to help us get to our end goal and analyse our past actions to see if this approach worked for us. But it's another thing entirely to adopt this into a semi-structured approach to reviewing articles.
Yeah. And at the same time, it might seem paradoxical to force what seems like such a free-flowing and adaptive method of learning and understanding into any sort of structure. However, our experience through the research process up until this point had made it clear that having some sort of structure in place helps provide safety and confidence as we learn, which allowed us to focus fully on the task at hand without sort of doubt or worry as to whether we were doing things right. We'll talk more about this and some other somewhat paradoxical aspects of the process a bit later.
So we decided that we were taking this approach of philosophical hermeneutics, but we were left up with the problem of trying to find an approach that worked for our group. So what did we come up with?
Well, we've created an innovative group approach to data extraction and interpretation, which we've affectionately named speed dating the texts.
So how do you speed date a research paper?
Well, our process involves selecting 5 papers of a similar length at a time from our literature pool. We selected 5 papers because there are 5 of us, meaning each researcher would have a separate paper at any one time.
And following this initial selection of texts, each researcher had one of these 5 papers and was given 7 minutes to briefly read the paper and take notes on the essence of the paper and how they felt about the things in the paper as they read.
7 minutes is an oddly specific time. How did we decide on that again?
Well, initially we allocated 5 minutes, and I thought that was enough time to skim through the paper.
But I found that this wasn't enough time for me, so I asked if we could try 10 minutes, which felt better for me, but the others found that it was a little bit too much time.
Therefore, in an act of compromise, we decided to land in the middle and go with 7 minutes, which actually ended up working great.
And following the 7 minutes with each paper was then rotated to the next researcher in the circle, and the process was repeated until every paper had been read by every researcher. We've represented this process in the diagram you can see on the slide.
After reading all of the papers in the round, we engaged in a group discussion that was framed by Noblet and Hare's theories of reciprocal translation and refutational synthesis. Those are pretty big terms, but to put them simply, reciprocal translation involves identifying key concepts and themes in each article and attempting to translate them into each other to figure out how the concepts and studies relate to each other. Whereas refutational synthesis does the opposite, comparing the contradictions between the studies in order to promote reflection and intellectual discourse on the significance of the differences.
Basically, the person who had read the paper last during the speed dating rotation led the discussion, sharing their insights on the paper. The rest of us were then encouraged to share our own insights in any areas we disagreed on. This ensured everyone remained an active participant in the discussions.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't think it was necessary to place a time limit on these discussions because this is where we really found our true gold in terms of our interpretations. However, we did minute and record the discussions so that we could refer to them in the future if we wanted to. From these discussions, we wrote down any recurring themes and tensions, which then became our rudimentary codes. This whole process of speed dating with 5 papers and the subsequent group discussion was repeated for the total number of papers in our text set, which was 30. It wasn't planned that the total number of papers was easily divisible by the number of researchers, but it certainly made the process a lot easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And while repeating the process for the rest of the papers, these rudimentary codes that we were finding were written and kept inside of us at all times in the middle of a table so that they could be considered and refined with the new literature. Every time we read new papers, we then identified similar codes and we could all put these together to make better themes. Overall, we think that this method really held collaboration in esteem and was a very approachable way of engaging with interpretive research for the first time.
So, with the background of philosophical hermeneutics and relational humanism and the speed dating process out of the way, it was time to actually start deeply engaging with the texts. And as you can imagine, philosophical hermeneutics and relational humanism were just as important in this part of our project. Now, we were very fortunate at this stage because we had a 6-week intensive research block as part of our 4th year curriculum. Now, this enabled us to be fully present with the research and with each other, as we didn't have the distractions of placement and other study.
Yes, exactly. And to begin this next phase, we used the rudimentary codes developed in our speed dating process to elucidate and collate key quotes that represented each code. Through group discussion, we used these codes to elucidate congruent and conflicting concepts and tensions. Following this, we began our conceptual development phase in order to develop overarching principles and themes. This involved daily group discussions, reflective inquiry, and question-answer dialogues.
Daily group discussions enabled us to further enhance our relational presence with each other by spending time together working towards a common goal. In addition, it gave us the opportunity to discuss aspects of the literature we found that we agreed with, or aspects we found challenging. Reflective inquiry and question-answer dialogues were essential in deepening our understanding of the texts. Through continually asking questions of the text and ourselves, we were able to generate new knowledge, meaning, and understanding.
After individual reflective inquiry and question-answer dialogues, we would once again engage in group discussion. This was especially critical as it enabled us to develop a collective understanding through challenging our assumptions and reflecting on our decision-making and conceptual development. Using this process, we were able to collaboratively develop 3 key themes regarding the nature of end-of-life conversations in the emergency department. Now, this process was riddled with paradoxes, the main one being the quick nature of speed dating to enable the slower and deeper understanding of text.
Yeah, that's right. By undertaking a brief exploration of the text and the concepts in each text set, we were able to stimulate deeper thoughts, which allowed us to deeply engage with 30 papers in a very efficient but also interpretive way. Now, another paradox here is where the relationships were found. People often think of dating as relationships between people. However, it was vitally important for us to also develop relationships with each text.
Yeah, exactly. And this sort of created a chicken and egg situation. The pre-existing relationships we had with each other allowed us to form a strong and cohesive relational presence. And then our deep understandings allowed us to engage with uncertainty and value difference. And this relational presence then allowed us to develop relationships with the papers, which then further developed the relationships between ourselves. And so it went round and round.
So what you're saying is that in a sense, the relationships with the people enabled relationships with the paper, but equally the relationships with the paper enabled relationships with people.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Another paradox can be found in the normally rigid structure of speed dating, yet the organic form it took for us because of our underlying relational presence. For a process like this to work, having a pre-existing relationship with each other was beneficial, as it allowed us to share our thoughts without hesitation and simply challenge one another in order to reach a shared horizon of understanding.
That's right. So even though the formal structure of speed dating was rigid, that is, we had our 7 minutes with each text and we rotated it around and we did our discussions at the end, it really took on a more organic and fluid approach during our discussions.
Yes, exactly.
I think it's also important that we talk about how we manage power imbalances and differing ideas.
Yeah, for sure. It is important to note that in order to reach a collective understanding, it was vital to create a non-judgmental space that allowed us to all feel supported and allowed us all to feel free that our voice was heard and appreciated. And this meant we had to create a space without power imbalance.
Yes, exactly. And being rooted in relational humanism, we applied this by allowing each of us to take the lead at different times. So as we previously described, during the speed dating process, once all of the 5 texts had been read by everyone, the person who had read the paper last led the group discussion, and that person made sure to encourage all other members to also share their thoughts on the paper.
Precisely. And by doing that, we were all able to contribute, which removed any sense of power hierarchy.
And I also think that something that prevented a power imbalance was the ownership we were encouraged to take of our research topic and process. And this kind of began from the very first day of our research project, where our supervisors used an open dialogical process to engage us as students in order to embrace relational humanism.
Yeah, that's really true. I think it's really easy for, supervisors and teachers sometimes to be more directive and forceful on what we did. But by allowing us to take the lead and take ownership of the project that we were doing, they really shared this power with us.
Yeah, exactly. And having spoken to Karin and Anne recently, this was something that they had deliberately chosen to do.
Overall, the speed dating process worked for us because of our relational presence with each other and with our supervisors. So, while it may look like a process that is very reproducible, it was actually the result of a rich and deep collaboration. This leads to the question, can this be applied elsewhere?
I think it can. I think it's a process that suits itself to an interpretive or qualitative paradigm very nicely.
I agree. And I think it may not work as effectively with quantitative data, as it may be more difficult to gain an understanding of the text in such a short speed dating time. So what we're trying to say is that this relational constructionist model of learning and understanding is broadly applicable beyond the field of medical research or even research more generally.
Exactly. And I think it's really important to focus on the fact that this isn't just about research. Learning as a group and learning from others' experience could be really valuable in places such as professional learning, learning skills, or conceptual knowledge learning and understanding. I think it could be very valuable for learning in small groups or even in a classroom.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think through developing a strong sort of relational presence, a group might be able to determine common goals, which would then enable them to undertake skills training or other forms of learning. And then by undertaking this learning as a group with a robust foundation in relational humanism, they might be able to develop a strong collective understanding that supersedes the sum of their individual parts of understanding.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also important to appreciate that it's because of the paradoxical elements that this process really worked.
Speed dating isn't really about being quick and developing new relationships, but rather being slow and building on established relationships.
Yeah. So to finish off, we want to pose some questions to the audience to consider at their leisure. So firstly, how significant an impact would it have on the group's relationality if group members didn't know each other as well beforehand?
I think another question could be, are there strategies that could be used to enhance group relationality? Is this something that would take a significant amount of time, or would it be able to be achieved more rapidly if you only had limited time?
Yeah. And are there possibilities for this process to be applied to larger groups, or would that inhibit the group's relational presence?
I think another thing to consider, given the conference that we're currently speaking at, what is the impact that relating has on education? How can this be enhanced in order to enable the best educational opportunities possible?
I think they are all really important questions. And they're definitely questions that I think the 5 of us will continue to reflect on ourselves.
I agree. But for now, we'll leave it at that. We would like to thank the Teos Institute for kindly giving us the opportunity to present our findings to you today.
We also want to thank our supervisors, Karin and Anne, for all the hard work that they've put in and all the support and guidance that they've given us in doing this project over the last 2 years.
And finally, we hope that this approach may be of use to you and whatever group you find yourself in, be that research, education, or any other aspect of relating to others in the future.
Thank you.
And here are our contact details if you want to be in touch in the future. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.